Hi, everyone, and happy Wednesday lunchtime. For those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Laura Desveaux. I'm the founder and executive director of Women Who Lead. If you don't know what Women Who Lead is, then you're in for a little bit of a treat. You'll get a flavor for what the organization is and what we do, and can check out more on our website, www.womenwholead.com. We do authentic and action-oriented strategic events like this one, although the flavor for today is a little bit different. So I'm going to dive right in. We have the pleasure today, and I promise, Simone, I won't embarrass you at length, but of hearing from and speaking with Simone Harrington, who is the Vice President at the Institute for Better Health at Trillium Health Partners. She was also is it a 2022? Do they do it by year? The WXN Top 100? She's just an exceptional human.
So.
And so not surprised that she received that recognition in the Mercedes-Benz Emerging Leader category. But really, one of the reasons I asked Simone if she was willing to have this sort of what we framed as a fireside chat is that she is a wealth of strategic knowledge and a fierce supporter of anyone's career development, but I think holds a special place in her heart for supporting, lifting, and amplifying the women around her. So for those of you that have joined us before, we're going to take a bit of a different approach. This dialogue between Simone and I is going to be very much like the dialogues we have when we catch each other in the hallway at work, when we're catching up over a glass of wine or two, talking about our careers. So what I'm going to do is I have a couple of questions that I've prepared just to anchor us. We might go in an entirely different direction. I will also keep an eye on the chat and try to bring in your comments, questions, queries as we go. And like all of our events, we'll sort of open it up for a bit of back and forth as we get closer to 1 p.m. Simone, is there anything you would like to say to the group to sort of introduce yourself or orient us before we jump in?
Maybe I'll just take advantage of the question you put out to folks in introducing themselves in the chat. So lovely. I'm reading all of those hellos, and great to see the varied backgrounds, experience, and what's bringing folks to this conversation today. Laura, you said in introducing yourself, maybe share something that wouldn't be on the LinkedIn profile about you. So one of the things that I'll offer is that I am a mom to two small kids. One is 3 and one is 8, both of which are having medical kind of moments right now. So if one of them shows up to join us for a conversation, I think it'd be a great example of how managing life and career is all about integration. But I don't think that would be on the LinkedIn post, and just being really transparent about how today's conversation may proceed.
Very much appreciate that. I think it's also worth stating that unexpected company extends to everyone, doesn't matter. I see we have a couple of women joining us who are at home on maternity leave, pets, colleagues in the background, kids, all is welcome, but we'll dive right in. So Simone, you and I have chatted about this in relation to our own careers, but also I think we've noticed more broadly that many people are in this room and outside of this virtual room are in the early stages of defining or understanding their career strategy. And over the last few years, especially in healthcare, some people are reimagining it entirely. So my first question is, what is career strategy and how do you think about it?
So this talk is going to be approximately 4 to 7 hours now as a result of that question. So I hope everyone brought a snack. Okay, it is a big question, jokes aside, but let me maybe describe some of what comes to my mind in being asked that question. So, in looking at my background and my experience, and often when I have to describe to people who it is and what I do, you could look at my job titles and maybe be a little confused about my career trajectory. I've spent time in healthcare IT as a project manager. I've led the strategy function at Trillium Health Partners. I've led the people, volunteer, and strategy function at THP, and now I lead a research and innovation institute. And you might look at all of those different roles and say, what's the theme here? Like, how would you describe yourself, Simone? And like, how would you even describe your career and your career strategy? Because maybe at face value, it looks a little accidental, perhaps, but I have really cultivated and oriented my thinking around my career in thinking about it as a strategy. So I would personally describe myself as a strategist. I love spending time. For those of you who know kind of that strengths assessment, my number one strength in that Strengths Finders assessment is futuristic. I love thinking about the future. I love spending time thinking about the art of the possible, about how you make things better. And all of the roles that I have had in my work life to date have been about thinking about how do you make something better? How do you build better? What's the strategy to get there? How do you think about what's happening externally and internally to really then cultivate a path forward? And then what I'm exceptionally good at, if I really lean into not feeling that imposter syndrome and bragging a little bit, what I'm exceptionally good at is figuring out how you get there. What's the path from a vision to where we want to go? So I actually think a lot about my career with the same frame in mind. I think about it as a strategy. And as I was considering today's conversation and like what useful insights might I have to lend or to offer, I went back to an article that I read honestly pretty early in my career. It was sort of at the transition post my MBA, coming out of my time as a consultant in the professional services area and coming into the hospital world. And it's an article by Clayton Christensen. And some of you might know Clayton Christensen, kind of broadly known as the father of kind of modern business strategy, Porter's Five Forces type of thinking. And he wrote this article called How Will You Measure Your Life? And in the article, he talks about applying the tools of strategy to thinking about your career and thinking about your life more broadly. So the basic premise of it is to put yourself in, that proverbial rocking chair at 80, 90, in this day and age, maybe 115, end of life. And you're sitting on the porch and you're looking back on life. And what do you want to have been the impact? How are you going to measure whether your life has been the one you wanted, whether it's been successful or not? And I have really kind of grasped onto that as a way that I think about not only what do I want to do, but how am I then going to allocate my time and my energy towards that kind of end goal and that end orientation? So I think you can use similar principles as we do in any strategy, which is all about resource allocation and focus of time, energy, and people in looking inward on your own career. And it's something that I've spent a lot of time on individually, which is, what is my impact statement? What do I want to be the things that I accomplish? And not only just in looking at it in my work life, but looking at from the vantage point of me as a professional and as a person, kind of holistically. So spending time on impact statement is something that I've really tried to carve time out for. In that article, he will talk about how, doing that earlier rather than later in career is actually really important, because at least my experience is life doesn't get less complicated, it gets more complicated. And there isn't fewer demands on your time, there's more demands on your time, and there aren't fewer responsibilities, there's more responsibilities to grapple with. So taking that strategy kind of approach and thinking about being intentional about what you want to do, and then being really intentional about how you allocate your time and your energy towards that impact statement is kind of my mental model. And anyone who knows me will not be shocked to hear that I use like a strategy framework and thinking about those things, because it's a bit innate to who I am. But I really try to approach it with that kind of frame in mind.
Not surprisingly, there's 817 different directions I would like to go from that, but I'm gonna try to follow one and remember the second. One of the things that I think, intimidate is the wrong word, but one of the things that I am impressed by and value about you is your, like, Simone's strategic muscle is like, she must spend every day in the strategy gym. Like it's daunting and something to aspire to. But the reason I bring that up is because as you've sort of walked us through things, it is for you, it's a strategy framework. And for me, very early in my career, I was like, I don't impact, like, I don't really know. And so where I started, in case you're having those reactions and thinking this is 5 steps ahead, is I looked at, you can look at your week, you can look at the activities that you, or projects you work on or what have you. And I did sort of what some people will describe as an energy audit. And I was like, what do I love? And what do I kind of wish I could give away if, this was a blue sky scenario? And I mapped those things, and then I paid attention to what energized me. And it was through reflecting on that and asking the question, what about this excites me? What do I want to explore? What are my strengths? What have you? That I started to figure out, like, that was looking back now for me, that was the sort of beginning of my career strategy journey, was sort of taking stock of where I was and what was happening. So I just wanted to offer that to people in case when you hear strategy framework, you're pulling up Google and saying, like, most common strategy framework and trying to figure out where to go. But the second thing I wanted to jump on was, and shocker, the scientist in the room goes to psychology, but the principle of mental accounting is one that is really helpful here, because as humans, we categorize everything. Like it helps reduce cognitive load. But to your point, Simone, it also helps us, whether we know it or not, allocate resources, whether it's in our job and allocating human or financial resources, or allocating our own time and energy. So we labeled this talk around preparation and opportunity, because you and I have been having some conversations around that. So I'm wondering if you can sort of open the dialogue or black box around how you think about preparation versus opportunity in your career.
Yeah, I'm going to go to that. I want to make one little quick insight on the time audit, which I do think is hugely valuable and hugely insightful. Because the one thing we can all be reassured of is we're all experts in our own experience and like what drives value for us individually, and that is a hugely insightful thing to do, to get a sense of what does energize you, and where do you get your kind of juices flowing, so to speak, in your day. There's one aspect to that I think I would just offer as you do that kind of accounting, and there's huge utility in that. I think that being conscientious about achievement bias is important, though, in looking at that, okay? Because a lot of us, I'm going to hazard a guess, if you're in this instance a woman who carved an hour out of her day, and then reading the incredible backgrounds and experiences that are coming in the chat in terms of who's joined us today, I'm going to hazard a guess that we got a lot of achievers on this phone call as well, which is terrific and hugely important. People who are highly oriented towards achievement will have a bias towards things that deliver tangible value more in the immediate, okay? And that is good. That is part of the energy audit. But also, don't be afraid to look at the things that maybe you don't enjoy, but that are important to you as well. Like preparing a meal for my 3-year-old. I don't particularly enjoy that, let's say. 90% of the time, it's probably going to get rejected or thrown on the floor, or what was asked for is not going to be ultimately what would prefer to be consumed at the time it is provided to said customer. But I know that it's important that I cultivate that experience for her, right? Like understanding food, gaining insight into how she, like preparing it, sharing that with her, learning about what she likes and she dislikes. So in looking at it, I think you got to make sure you take the broadest frame of what you value and what brings energy in doing that type of audit. Because I think many of us, if we are achievement oriented, you may have a bias towards things that have more kind of immediate, if I use the word gratification. And one of the things that's important is not having some of that, I would say, bias creep into thinking about your impact statement when you're looking really, really long range too. So just that's something that I've learned about myself too, because I will immediately put energy into things that have a shorter term reward. But like any good investment approach, you want to make sure you have different types of things that you're putting your time and energy into, some that may be more near term and some that may be more long term. And the reverse is true too, right? Like making sure that you aren't overly investing that time and energy into just the achievement oriented things, because they are, even if they're not enjoyable, they might yield the quickest returns, and thinking about kind of that balance. So that was just one thing that came to mind when you were talking, Laura, that I wanted to just offer as an additional insight as you do kind of that audit of what you like and where you want to go.
It also, all offer a reflection and then I'll restate the question. That one of the ways in which my categories have evolved in my career is not just like Simone knows this about me quite intimately. Like, I like to get things done. I have literally no patience, none, doesn't exist, working on it. It's really hard. I don't like the patience gym at all. But at any given time, in addition to like what brings you joy, which might be a type of activity, like there's different ways you can define it. I now layer on, where am I delivering? Where am I developing? And where am I exploring? Because they're all, and I think this will sort of feed into the question for you, Simone, but all three of those things matter when we think about the trajectory of a career. And early on, and I think this is sometimes because of the messaging we get, we think we just need to be delivering and developing experts, like being experts all the time. And it's in these sort of like fireside chats or one-on-one conversations with people that you realize, like, we're figuring it out as we go. We're working towards that competency. And one of the rules I have is that when I identify where I want to develop, I never say no when that opportunity comes my way, even though it terrifies me. So I think you, in your journey with the WXN award and connecting with that network, did some reflection to sort of very scientifically put together the sort of framework you have for your career strategy. And two of the categories that came out were preparation versus opportunity. Do you want to feel free to pick up at any point of that? But I've really enjoyed hearing your thinking there, and I think the group will as well.
Oh, yeah. So Laura is referring to something that I have named my lucky strategy, my lucky framework, so to speak. And whenever I present it to my highly scientifically oriented team, I always put the caveat that it is based 100% not on evidence and 100% on my own personal experiences and anecdotes from my life. So with that in mind, the lucky framework. So I called it the lucky framework because a lot of people have sort of said to me, oh, like, you've been lucky in your career. You've had great leaders. You've had, you've been in the right place at the right time in organizations or in your education to capitalize and, be there when the opportunity presented itself. And to be honest with you, that always kind of bugged me a little bit. One, because as a strategist, I don't like the concept that anything wasn't oriented with purpose and intention, but also because I sometimes felt like it sort of devalued my accomplishment in that conversation. So I came across a quote, which I've actually learned was originally by Socrates, but I heard it from Oprah, full disclosure, which is, luck is actually where opportunity and preparation meet. So if you aren't prepared to take advantage of an opportunity that presents itself, like, that might pass you by. But sometimes it looks like luck to folks because, oh, the right thing came up and you were in the right place at the right time. We always forget to mention you also had the right experience, capabilities, relationships, contacts. Like, it's so much more than just being in the right place at the right time. So the way that I like to talk about preparation versus opportunity is, let's start on the opportunity side. Most people, when they come to talk to me about career planning, they want to talk about opportunity. They tend to come and like, no judgment, I think this is generally how we talk about careers. They come with kind of the ladder mentality in mind. Like, I'm here now, I want to get to here. How do I get to manager, director, vice president, whatever that looks like? And though that's an important part of the conversation, however, it isn't necessarily where I think people should focus. I think people should focus on the preparation side of things. So when I think about my career, what I like to do is sort of draw a box around where I am right now. So VP at the Institute for Better Health. And then I like to think about, like, what are all the possible off ramps from this job? Like, where could I go as a next opportunity that's keeping with my impact statement? And mine is very much oriented around making healthcare better in Canada. And there's a lot of different ways you can contribute to that. So I make my off ramps. Like, right now I have about 4 that I kind of think about as potential next jobs that would be interesting and attractive to me. And then what I spend a lot of time doing is actually thinking about what am I doing right now in the job that I'm in to get the experience, the exposure, build the relationships, and be intentional with my time in my job and invest, the A+ energy to the things that are going to help galvanize that future, and maybe the C- energy to things that like are important, but they're not actually going to be that helpful long term in terms of my career pathing and planning. And within that framework, I really like to think about 80% of my time should go towards preparation activities. So really cultivating the experience, the exposure, talking to my leader about those things. So not saying like, hey, when do you think I'll be ready for promotion? When do you think I'll be ready for this next role? When do you think this job might become, what other jobs are available? Like that should be 20% of your time. You shouldn't ignore it. And again, like highly scientific 80-20 here, folks, like it's an art, not a science, but that 20% of your time should exist. Like you should be building relationships, understanding the market, what jobs are growing, what jobs are shrinking, what new jobs are maybe coming up in spaces you're interested in. That is important. But what I find is a lot of people put too much energy into opportunity and then they don't cultivate the preparation so that when that dream job does come up or someone calls you say like, hey, so-and-so is hiring for this role, that would be, really in keeping with your career trajectory, you haven't done the preparation work, right? And you're not ready to actually capitalize on that opportunity. So I find it's a really useful model too with my teams in being able to spend time in really deeply understanding what we want to make sure they're getting out of the job and the opportunity that they're in right now. Not only because it helps me build succession, which is an important part of my job as a leader, but also because I find I get so much more affinity and talent when they feel seen, when they feel like I understand that future-oriented kind of view of who they are, where they want to go, what they want to be. And then we can talk about within their job, because everyone has a job and everyone has accountabilities, but sort of like within that, how do we craft the right experience and exposure within your set of responsibilities to help get you where you want to go?
A quick reflection, and then there's a really great question in the chat that I'll pull in. The reflection is, I put this in the chat as well as you were speaking, Simone. I was like, "Ooh, I see myself in this, and I don't know if I like it." Except was very aware that my orientation is and has been in the past very much to like, what's the ladder? And people will say that a lot. People will say it sometimes in interviews, like, what is the progression from here? And through conversations with my mentors, but actually, even though my mentors had said it to me, it didn't really land for me until my dad passed away 9 months ago, and he had written an email to myself and my siblings that that existed, but I didn't read until after he had passed. And one of the things he said in that email, I think is very relevant here. He said, don't take for granted the things you already have. And what I'll edit for this conversation is where you already are. Because to other people, you have what they're looking for. And the reason I bring that up is because, and full disclosure to the group, Simone has actually said this to me in some way, shape, or form before, that it's also, if you're constantly thinking about the next part on the ladder, are you ever enjoying it when you get there? Like, are you sinking in? And it's part of the preparation and the experience, but when it was framed in that way for me, like, are you actually celebrating and sinking into the thing that you were chasing? For whatever reason, that was the sort of light bulb moment that recalibrated the way that I thought. And the 80-20, I think, is also helpful because I think to myself, in my current role, 80% of what I do should be within the scope of that role. 20% should be developing, preparing, stretching me. And sometimes I'll hear people say, well, that's sort of outside of my role. And I find that that's where some of the opportunity comes in. We can't change your role entirely. We may not need a full-time person in that role yet, but let's start to cultivate the experience and test the waters and see what comes up there. I'll pause there in case there's anything you want to add, and then I'll jump to the question in the chat.
I want to acknowledge a comment in the chat that I couldn't actually agree more with. And I think it's an important part as leaders as we think about cultivating opportunities. And it's the comment around privilege and access to opportunities, and that is real. I 100% do acknowledge that. And the flip side to the intentionality of how you're cultivating your career is how are you cultivating opportunities for other people? So I think quite intentionally and get input from many in who am I coaching, mentoring, and sponsoring? What does that look like? Am I cultivating opportunity for many, or am I only cultivating opportunity for few? Like, there's a whole flip side to this conversation that is not when you're thinking about it for yourself, but when you're thinking about it as a leader, and how you drive much more equity and access into that dialogue and that conversation with intention and with purpose. Because otherwise, for sure, we can perpetuate on the opportunity side inherent privilege, inherent bias, the kind of leaky pipeline view of the world where talent isn't being afforded both the opportunity for preparation for opportunity, but also to participate in dialogues around opportunity as well. And I think that is the flip side of how I think about it as a leader, in really driving that and thinking more comprehensively, and also acknowledging that for people who don't identify the way I do as a cis white woman, the way that at preparation occurs is also totally different. And I have to be mindful of that in thinking about that with my teams and in the leaders that I'm cultivating. So, I would say that that's an early part of the journey of where I'm unpacking and better understanding that. But I did want to acknowledge that is something that does have to be acknowledged.
Thanks so much for picking up on that comment. I think it's a whole, we can have a whole other webinar around the leadership skills and approaches for sort of tailoring to intersectional identities and differential access to try to close those gaps. There's a really, and this is my segue now, one of the ways I think we're able to do that in this session is through sort of knowledge and dialogue. So one of the things we know when we think about gender equity is that men have sort of these tacit informal networks where they're routinely sharing information about careers and strategy and organizational politics. And as women, we don't do that as naturally and organically as our male colleagues. So I'm hoping that some of our conversation today will help sort of serve those insights up for the group. And Anjum had a really great question in the chat. Any tips for areas that people should prepare around that they don't typically think about?
Well, one that I'll mention is a bit related to Lauren's subsequent question around factoring in like your whole life into kind of the planning trajectory. So I have so many musings on this. I'll try to offer just a couple to be a bit succinct. I mean, the first one I think is people actually don't think about that life integration. They don't think about the priorities outside of the job, maybe, that they have to balance. Like another framework that I use sometimes, I'm a framework fanatic, so forgive me, but is trying to kind of think about where I'm at in 3 buckets. There's what I need in my career, like drivers, that opportunity. That's really like what you've put in your preparation buckets, all the things you want to cultivate and develop for where you are right now. And then there's values, right? And values these are these really sticky things. Like I'm sure all of you, if I asked, could tell me about a time you were either in a job, a role, a project, an assignment, or had a boss and you hated it. And like there were probably value issues there in terms of like misalignment of values you didn't agree with. Values are very sticky throughout your career and throughout your life. They do evolve, but I find generally like they're the things that when you find yourself in a place where your values aren't aligned, it feels really terrible and really yucky. And then you have priorities. So to the question of are there things that people tend not to think about, I don't know that people are always as intentional about linking in the priorities of like where they are in this moment of life into then doing career planning. So, and priorities can look different. They're going to shift throughout your life. For me right now, as a parent who has small children at school, a partner who's also a professional, and I don't have family that lives nearby to where I am, education isn't high on my priority list right now. I'm quite happy to live my master's life and set aside formal education. But each of you are going to have your own individual priorities. For maybe that's supporting aging parents. Maybe that is pursuing a PhD, pursuing education. Maybe that's volunteering in your community and you've committed to some very specific things that you're doing outside of work. And looking at all 3 of those things together, I think, is an important way of assessing opportunities, because if you find something that's going to give you everything you want in terms of like the career experience, but it's not going to work with your personal priorities, that's not going to be a really, really good fit. So I really do think thinking about this holistically is the way that I do try to approach it, in terms of understanding, as a friend, as a daughter, a mother, a wife, a colleague, a community member. What are all the other things that I want to factor into some of that? So that's my first musing. And maybe I'll stop there because I have another thought, but maybe see what, Laura, you think about that.
I'll share two things. One is like liking from every different social account I have the comment around values. And it took me a while to get to mine. Like, as I started articulating my career strategy, I didn't start with values, but now I coach everyone around doing it that way. And like, you can Google values list. I use Brene Brown's. I don't know why, probably because it's formatted in a visually appealing way, but I digress. Identify 2 to 3. And usually when I ask people to do that exercise, they come up with 7, 9, sometimes 13. And I'm like, there is something on that list, usually ideally 2 things, that you cannot cross off. And now sometimes family is a core value for people. Crossing off family does not mean you're not family oriented, to be clear, but my 2, just to open that black box, are growth and impact. And once I identified those, and you'll see that, values will overlap, you need to define how they're operationalized, because what those terms mean will be different for everybody. Everything I do now used to feel very disoriented and disconnected, but everything connects to those 2 things. I care about my growth. I care about supporting the growth of others. I care about having impact through the scientific work that I do. I care about having impact through mentorship and building and lifting others. That's where Women Who Lead came from. And so this brings me to a sort of now direct answer to Anjum's question. I think what people often overlook is why. Why does this matter to you? Because they'll come to you for the what or the how. But sometimes it's because there's noise from other people, or this happens a lot in healthcare. We think this is the trajectory because it's the only one we see. So my first tip is like, be clear about why. Like, why does this matter to you? And of course, the what and how is part of the strategy and tactic, but you're just going to keep coming back and feeling unfulfilled if you can't identify what's driving you. Recognizing that can shift. Your impact statement, which Simone referenced earlier, can shift over time. Your core values likely won't. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I get people asking me a lot when I do this exercise in workshops, like, is it personal or professional values? They're the same.
They are the same thing.
They are your core values.
And if they're not, that's a whole other session.
Yes. But I think the thing I want to say there is that often when people think about a career ladder, the reason values matter is because people start climbing a ladder and it's against the wrong wall. Like, it's actually not where you want to be, and you're not going to be happy. You're going to be frustrated. And that's why the why matters so much. And the lower you are to the ground, the easier it is to, step over, the safer it feels to step sideways onto the right ladder. Doesn't mean you can't laterally pivot, but just I'm a big metaphor person. The other thing I'll say that people often don't think about, and I'm biased here because I'm a behavioral scientist, I spend way too much time, my partner would tell you, thinking about what other people think and how they think. But that's exactly it. Is I think people want to be seen, heard, and felt, of course. But to what extent do you get curious about those around you? And so if I'm walking into a meeting with my leader, what are their challenges? What problems do they need to solve for? My colleagues, I like, as you think about ascending, it's not just you. And it reminds me of that statement that people will often say to their kids, like, treat others like you want to be treated. And I think if we apply that here, it's, if you would like people to invest in you and be interested in you, then similarly show that same investment and curiosity about the environment you're in and those around you, presuming that it's a safe environment to do so. But I would say those are my 2 things: to be really clear on the why and your values, and sort of like, treat others like you want to be treated. Get equally curious about, I think just in the last week, I sent a message to Simone that was like, thanks so much for something. I feel like I say thank you a lot, but not enough. Because even though I don't have visibility into all the things that she manages, I know there's a lot that I don't see. Like, I probably see 20% of what's on her plate. And I think that it's important to recognize that just because we don't see movement, for those of us that are impatient, it doesn't mean that we haven't created visibility and dialogue. Because the sort of higher you get on that ladder, the more things you're juggling. The further you get in life, the more things you're juggling. And the more we can think about the circumstances of the people around us, I think the better it equips us to operationalize our strategy. Go for it. There's something on the tip of your tongue.
Okay, so you were talking about understanding in roles and opportunities, what is it that whether it's the hiring manager, the leader of the function, the president of the company or the organization, one of the number one things I observe people do in job interviews is they think it's about coming in and selling themselves. That is fundamentally wrong. Okay, it's sort of right, but it's also fundamentally wrong. That is actually about convincing the people in front of you that you're the right person to solve whatever problem it is that they have in front of them. And the number one thing I think I watch people do, and I've done a lot of interviews, I led our talent function for a while at the organization, is people don't spend enough time connecting who they are, because you do need to sell who you are, like I'm being a bit cheeky, with what the problem the organization is facing. And the best way to do it is to say, hey, Laura, hiring manager, I think in looking at this role, am I right? Like, are you worried about these three big things? And typically they'll either say yes, no, or you got some of it right, and let me add context. And then you use that to answer why you're the best candidate for the job. Okay, great. Let me tell you about how I can solve this problem. Let me talk to you about how I bring this to the table. Let me give you examples of how I've delivered on problem 3 to help solve that for you. And it's sort of related to, there's another question in the chat I wanted to jump on with this thread, if that's okay, Laura. And it's around, I get this question a lot around people feeling like, okay, I'm in a job right now. I would like to get into leadership. And Anjum, correct me if I get any of in like understanding your question incorrect, but I want to go here. And people are telling me, but I need that experience to go there. Like, how am I going to get the experience of that job without being in that job? So one of the great pieces of advice that I've gotten over the years is to think about, and this does come back to like the preparation framework thing. So a lot of times when people are like trying to go after a management job, or it's your first formal leadership role, they'll say, what do I say in the interview or in the conversation, where it's like, how have you led people manage budgets, manage time? I'm like, I haven't officially done that. But generally speaking, what I find is really useful is you can talk about, how have you done that? Have you managed a project? Have you managed a specific deliverable? Have you been singularly accountable for leading a team through a part of a project even? Because what people are looking for, I believe, in those questions of how have you led teams, they want to understand how you organize towards objectives. They want to understand how you manage risks and issues as they come up. And they want to understand how you influence people towards kind of that outcome. And being able to reframe that in your mind to think about, okay, well, what am I doing right now in my work where I am doing that through influencing and responsibility, even if I don't have the authority necessarily to officially be the leader per se, because then you're cultivating the experience that you actually need towards answering that type of question in an interview setting, or even just, part of it is mentality, right? Like believing you do those things and believing that you have that capability and capacity to do those things when you're in a setting where you're trying to describe that experience to someone else.
The other thing, I feel like this is taking me back several years to our very first Women Who Lead event, but I'll repeat it for those of you that weren't there, is that women will typically apply for a job if they feel they meet 100% of the criteria, and men will apply when they meet 40 to 50. And so here's the not so big secret that you need to tell everybody. No one is expecting you to come into a job and perform at like full job competency. If that was the case, you would be underpaid, because you're already doing that job now. And that's not to say, again, lateral moves are a different conversation. But what you actually have to demonstrate is your capability to grow within the role and meet the objectives and solve the problems. So one of the things I often say, not every leader will take this perspective, is that I care less about the skills you have today and more how you think, because how you think tells me more about how you're going to grow and develop. And so the interviews where I get the most excited is where I get to better understand the way someone thinks through a problem. It doesn't, I'm not saying this isn't sort of an either or, that technical skills and describing your competencies through examples doesn't matter. But you know, often job postings are also written where you're like, if someone has every single one of these, they're a unicorn. And so it's fine to acknowledge these are the things, these are the skills and strengths I bring into the role, and these are the ones that I'm still cultivating. Now, here's another career hack. When we're thinking about preparation versus opportunity, think about the jobs you might want in the future. Look at the postings for them now.
Totally.
What skills are they looking for? What do they require? That's your roadmap or your compass to what you need to prepare, how you cultivate things, how you develop opportunities. Relatedly, another strategy you could use is if someone has a job that is interesting to you, reach out for a quick coffee chat and just say, you know, I'd love 15 or 20 minutes of your time to understand how you've thought about your career and how you got to where you are. Like, it doesn't require anyone doing anything more than telling their story, but it equips you with information about the how of preparation, and the fact that increasingly more so we're moving towards a professional reality where it's not a straight line. Like it seems like bumps and it seems messy and there's a lot of twists and turns. I do want to pick up on one comment in the chat from someone, Ashley, around with the preparation aspect in mind, do you use or recommend the LEADS framework? Before I hand it over to you, Simone, the only comment I'll make there is, like, essentially all frameworks are the same. Like there are distinct elements of different frameworks. They'll use different terms. Leading self in the LEADS framework is rooted in emotional intelligence. But what I say to people is, like, use whatever is intuitive to you. Like if you read those terms and you don't have to read the definition 7 times and it makes sense, and those are sort of the competencies that you want to cultivate, that's where you should start. I think where we get ourselves into trouble and start feeling like imposters is when we try to shoehorn ourselves into a framework that just doesn't fit with the way we think. Like if Simone was like, here's my favorite strategy framework, I might be like, that's really cool. I don't have 40 hours to study it. So I'm going to go with the thing that is accessible to me cognitively. Simone, I don't know if you want to comment on that, given that you are a resident framework fanatic.
I mean, the irony here is, like, I'm like, I don't know what the LEADS framework is, so it's obviously not one
I
that
Googled
I
it.
personally have leaned into. I think your advice generally, though, is like, frameworks are tools, right? So you got to go and seek out tools that you that are the right ones for you. There's no magic in a framework. There's no, secret, there's no secret framework that's going to be the one that works for everyone. There are tools that I use to describe the way we think about things so that you have something to anchor a conversation to. And that's generally how frameworks, I think, work across the board. They're a means of communication more so than they are. And again, hashtag not a scientist. There's obviously like very relevant scientific frameworks, but even in science, like, science is an evolving thing. It's not static, right? Science is the cultivation of knowledge. And if we're not continuously challenging the latest thinking or theory, and I think sometimes people confuse that science is about fact. It's not. It's about a way of understanding our world currently, right? It's not dogma. It's knowledge creation. And so similarly, find the framework that helps you organize your thinking, that feels good to you, that meets you where you are. I mean, I do enjoy the one that thinks about how you divide your time up in terms of, like, 70% of what you should be doing should be kind of on the job, in the job, 20% in terms of informal training, volunteering, attending sessions like this, and only like 10% really in formal education and training. Because typically, there's a reason education and training is the last section on a resume. Most of the time people want to see the bullets under job titles, like, what'd you get done? What were the results? What did you achieve? And talk to me about how those results could potentially be beneficial to us and to our team. Laura, may I? Not the facilitator, but may I? There's a question around in the chat around any advice for those who may not even really know where they want to go, job next, but they're looking for a new challenge, a new opportunity. I wanted to pick up on something you were saying earlier around exploration of career options. So Laura gave a couple of great tactics that I would even recommend in a situation like that. Go read some job postings, look at what's out in the environment that's interesting or useful to you. coming out of my MBA, I was at a bit of an apex of not being sure. I had a couple of different paths I was thinking about, but candidly, I wasn't really exactly, I knew I wanted a new challenge. There were parts of consulting I'd really enjoyed, but there were also some aspects to it that were leaving me not feeling as fulfilled as I thought was possible. And I did a lot of informational kind of conversations. And these are, informational interviews. You basically sit down with someone, you're like, tell me about your job. What do you like? What's exciting about it? Where do you see your industry or your area going? And talk a bit about yourself and say, within your organization, like, I'm not looking for a job. What I'm trying to do is understand how someone with my skills and my experience could fit into the industry that you're working within. And generally speaking, people are very generous with their time when you ask for this. Secondly, people generally enjoy talking about themselves, e.g. this seminar. And it's not a burden. Like, I think sometimes, especially for women, we feel like that's a burdensome thing. And I just would encourage you to reframe how you're thinking about that. People really actually enjoy talking about what they've learned, passing those lessons on. So, if you're sitting at a place where you're not actually sure what is the right next step or even the right next few steps, but you're not feeling fulfilled, my instinct is to say, one, spend some time just going back to impact statement. Like, what is it that I really want to be able to say I did? And then go out and, read job postings, chat to folks. LinkedIn is honestly such an amazing resource. I get outreach all the time from people, like cold calls. Hey, I'm interested in what you guys do at the Institute for Better Health. Is there someone who could talk to? Laura gets many of those referrals, so she can be my reference on that. But I do think, generally speaking, talent is going to be the number one issue of executives and leaders for the next 2 generations. So anyone who does want to spend time with talented people, understanding and cultivating what the potential could be for people who are interested in their, whether it's industry or organization, they're fundamentally not going to be successful. And so if they say no, there's probably a waste of time anyways. Most of us know that talent is going to be so important and would welcome a conversation like that. And then you can use those data points to really figure out maybe what that next step in your career is. So I just wanted to offer that as one thought that was running through my mind against that question, Laura.
Yeah, I'm going to offer a follow-up thought and then jump to another question in the chat from Laura. And the follow-up thought is that sometimes people will say, like, I don't know what I want to do. And when I ask them the question, what don't you want to do? Or what do you know? That's often a helpful place to start, because sometimes you're like, well, I'm most certain, and it can feel dramatic. Like, I most certainly don't want to go back to school. Great. I most certainly don't want to work in IT. Awesome. But sometimes the getting unstuck is in being generative about what you do know, so that it starts to narrow your focus a little bit. So I just wanted to offer that in case it was helpful. Lauren's question in the chat was, what additional factors do you take into account when you think about career trajectories in the context of your whole life? For example, do you take into account work-life balance, flexibility, retirement planning, et cetera? I'm going to put into the chat a Twitter thread that draws on data from the American Time Use Survey. And I suspect there will be certain, I like visuals, there's graphs of all this. It's time spent with family, time spent with friends, time spent with your partner. Anyways, Sahil Bloom, who I've linked this tweet thread for, makes a lot of great points. So I won't restate them here, but what I want to highlight here is time spent with coworkers. And the point I want to make is that increasingly, as I climb my own ladder, who I work with matters so much more. And it's partly because when you see those other graphs, the time you spent, like, I have a limited amount of time left with the only parent I have left. And I'm glad I spent the time I did with my dad before we lost him. Those are the things you're never going to regret. And the job won't love you back. Now, that doesn't mean that I put my feet up and I don't pour myself into my work, because I love the work that I do. I bring that up because the way that I think about the balance question is more about, like, it's constantly in flux, right? It's not a finite thing. It's more a constant negotiation. To Simone's point at the beginning of this webinar, she was like, I might have a visitor, I might get a call, we'll see how that goes. You don't get to control those things. So it's important to work with people who understand you're a whole person, And as leaders, I think it's important that we model that we're whole people and create the space for others to bring that reality into play when external pressures require that happens, or even just about getting to know each other. So my short answer to that question is really, I'm in, like, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And if you hate running, I'm sorry, it's a Harry Potter movie series, not a single episode. And everything for me now comes down to, I'll add a new category. It's the preparation and opportunity, but it's the culture. And the culture is set by the people. And if I get to work with good people, they're going to open my eyes up to things that I didn't realize I loved. They're going to change the way I think. And if I remind you of one of my core values around growth, like, that's what I'm here for. So part of it, Simone will often say that, like, the moment you write your strategy, it's out of date. And it's the same for your career. It's not that you can't execute against that strategy, but what I'm saying is give yourself the flexibility for it to evolve and accommodate those other parts of who you are and your life, because otherwise you're going to drive yourself crazy. And I think, again, this is an entire other dialogue of how we approach that. But my simple answer is just that I don't really have a proactive strategy. I just know that it matters, and I manage it as it presents itself, because we can't predict all of those things that happen outside of life, but we don't get that time with those people back. And similarly, I'll say to people, there's like a little visual that's like how we think everyone shows up and all the circles are full. I've sent this to my team at times, and it's like, what actually happens? And some days you're like fully there, and some days you're operating at half, some days you're at 20%, and that's the reality. And I think reminding ourselves of that, like, some days you're on and it's great, and some days you're showing up, and that's the contribution. And I think it's important to recognize that. But Simone, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts.
I wanted to add on the question of teams and people. The other thing is, great work tends to follow great leaders, right? Like, if you find someone and you're looking at an organization, and there was a question Caitlin just dropped in, like, how do you assess the culture of a place during an interview process? Well, like, look at the leaders. Where are they from? Where are they going? How long have they stayed there? What type of work do they typically do? Are they change builders, or are they more like guardian type of leaders? Like, they're going to come and watch over while things are stable and steady. Like, looking at the institutional leadership is often a good indicator of what is that board and what is that organization placing value on. And good work follows good leaders. Like, people who are big change leaders, if you want to do big change oriented work, you can bet they're probably leading an organization that has big change oriented work kind of wrapped around it. And I got that advice, like, pick leaders, not jobs. So early in my career, I've never regretted. And I've certainly regretted when I've ended up in places with leaders that I maybe wouldn't have picked myself. So I just wanted to layer that into the thinking about the who that you work with. And then to pick up on the thread of what's the word? I do always say a strategy or a plan is out of date the second you write it. It doesn't mean it's not still really, really useful, right? It helps you know when you're off course. It helps you know when you've gone away from what your core intent was. But if you set yourself up with a mentality of it's never going to change, that'll just be a recipe for disappointment. Expectation is the surest form of misery, for sure. So moderate your expectations around how much real control. And, I have had some life experiences over the past 5 and 10 years that have really taught me that ultimately I don't have a lot of control over the things that may happen in my world and in my environment. But life is going to happen. There will be good things and there will be beautiful things, and there are going to be hard and awful things that may potentially happen. But keeping your eye on the big picture, I think, really helps you ride those waves of uncertainty, ride those difficult moments, enjoy the highs when you're at the top of those crescendos as well too. But having the perspective in the bigger picture. And again, for me, that's where I try to lay my focus on, is maybe we had a bad day as a team, but did we have a good week? Did we have a good month? Did we have a good year? Maybe we had a hard meeting and maybe I don't feel like I showed up the best that I could have, even though I prepared. But on balance, how did my year look and how did my 5 years look? Because I do think it, especially again, that achiever propensity really orients you towards perfection. And I think if you focus on every single interaction needing to be perfect, you will miss the beauty that may exist in looking at the bigger picture of it all in your career. And I'll say I've learned in leadership that that's actually paramount too. Like, you're going to have team members who will make mistakes, will drop balls, they'll miss things, errors are going to happen. And if you ride them too hard on those particular instances and those moments, rather than really being able to cultivate a view of their contributions holistically, that is also a really challenging thing, I think, to do to team members that you work with and colleagues. Like, if someone lets you down, you're relying on them for something, you got to be able to look at the big picture and kind of navigate through it together with the broader relationship in mind, in my opinion.
As we wrap, Simone, I'm going to take up some airtime to give you a minute to brainstorm the final thought you want to leave the group with. But Caitlin, your question around how do you assess the culture of a place during the interview process, sort of two tactics I'll leave you with. One is saying, how would staff, how would the administrative assistant, like you could be role specific if you want, what words would they use to describe working here? And what would you say the strength is, and what is actually an area where the team needs to improve, like what's something you don't do so well, because we all have that. But I also, personally, I always speak to people that aren't on the interview panel. I speak to people who work there. I ask them what it's like. I ask them why they're there, why they went there, why they stay there, and what they think the opportunities for improvement are. The other thing, the sort of parting thought that I'll leave people with, and as Simone was talking, I just switched the metaphor in my head. It's less for me about the reason values matter, is that my ladder isn't oriented towards a what. It's not a title. And so now I'm like, instead of a ladder, it's more like a water slide. Like, it's a feeling. Like, I want to tap into growth and impact throughout my career. But the way I'll know that that's happening is because it feels fun. It feels exciting. Sometimes it's a little bit nerve-wracking. But I climbed up the ladder to the top of that water slide on purpose. And there's twists and turns and sort of goes different ways, but it's one of the, I would say it's the fundamental shift for me in my career, that I'm not, as a scientist, it feels odd to say that I'm not chasing something tangible or that I can name. I'm chasing a feeling. I'm chasing a way of working and the people I work with and the values that I can bring to life. And for some, if your mind is analytical like mine, that feels a little disconcerting. But what it makes possible for you is that, like, you are the compass. Like, the way that you feel is telling you whether or not you're climbing the right ladder or going down the right water slide. And there's something very liberating about that. Nobody else's framework, nobody else's strategy needs to be adopted by you because it's sort of uniquely yours. So Simone, over to you for sort of final reflections and or parting wisdom to leave the group with.
Thank you, Laura. And just thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And, the questions from everyone in attendance were so thoughtful. I come in and just quick say one small thing, because it's come up twice in the chat, the question of like, how do I convince my leader, my organization, like if there's something I want to do, you got to figure out what's in it for them, for better or for worse. Like, we can debate whether that should or shouldn't be the case, but it is, whether we like it or not. So if you want something, you got to figure out how to get to yes with them. And the number one way to do that is think about what's motivating them. What problem do they have? What challenge are they trying to solve for? And then come to them and explain why the thing you want to do helps with that. Because everyone comes to leaders all the time with, I want, we need, but very few people come to me and they're like, Simone, here's what I think your context and your challenges, and here's something I think we could do together that's good for me and good for the organization. And it's probably the most important thing I've learned about leadership is bring people ideas they can say yes to. Leaders want to say yes, but you got to bring some of their context in mind. Good leaders should be thinking about that. But in case you're not with one of those, that's my tip on how you unlock yes with people, is understand what they're motivated by. So here's my parting kind of thought, appreciating I've gone 2 minutes over a lot of time. So in the intro to that article that we talked about at the beginning, I'm just going to kind of read a little bit of a statement, because it says, this is like the summary of it. It says, in this article, he explains how exploring questions everyone needs to ask. How can I be happy in my career? How can I be sure my relationship with my family is an enduring source of happiness? And how can I live my life with integrity? The answer to the first question comes from Hertzberg's assertion that the most powerful motivator isn't money. It's the opportunity to learn, to grow in responsibilities, to contribute, and to be recognized. So if you aren't sure where to begin, I would begin by looking at those things and understanding where you can cultivate opportunities to really get them, whether it's at work, in where you volunteer, in the communities that you're a part of internally or external to your organization. But I think those are the compass by which I would, send us all away into the world with those insights.
Many thanks, Simone. I think just by the activity in the chat and some of the comments as we close, it sounds like this sort of more intimate fireside chat and feed off of audience thoughts and questions as we go is a format that's well received. What I love to see is there's always comments about how do we keep this going. And I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, perhaps just because Women Who Lead is a team of one at the moment, but we'll have more soon, and say, like, we often underestimate how much control we have. And so I've seen some people drop their emails in the chat. Like, it would be easy for someone to say, like, hey, email me if you're interested. I'll start a WhatsApp group, or I'll start a Slack channel, or I'll, like, whatever your affinity is or way of engaging. And so I just want to leave you with, I don't want to say, like, it's not an ask forgiveness instead of permission, but just instead of asking yourself, like, well, what is, and when can we, like, why not me? Like, what stops me from doing this thing? And I'm just using that example because it came up in the chat, that there's nothing that stops a member of the Women Who Lead community, or several members, from sort of organically developing pockets, communities of practice, ways for us to stay connected. So thank you very much. Have a fantastic Wednesday, and looking forward to next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.